Join us on a journey into tradition and faith. Dive deep into a captivating tale of culture, faith, and mystery in the transfer to the village. Follow Pastor Tunda and Abike as they navigate the complexities of their new assignment in a village rich in tradition and steeped in ancient customs. Will their faith stand strong against the village's long-held beliefs, or will the tension of two worlds collide? Don't miss out on the twists and turns of this powerful story. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience the unfolding drama. Hit the subscribe button, and let's embark on this incredible journey together. Pastor Tunda and his wife, Abike, had been serving in the city for many years, nurturing a small but vibrant congregation. They had built their lives around their ministry, spreading the gospel and helping those in need. But as with every journey, change was inevitable. One morning, the call came, a new assignment, a new beginning. They were to move to a small village deep in the heart of the land, a place known for its ancient traditions and deep-rooted culture. It was a challenge, one that they would accept with both excitement and trepidation. The village was in need of a shepherd, and Pastor Tunda was chosen to lead them. The village was a world apart from the bustling city. Located far from the nearest town, it was surrounded by dense forests and untamed nature, almost like a hidden kingdom that had remained untouched by the fast pace of modern life. It was a place where traditions were held sacred, where customs were passed down through generations, and where the people lived in harmony with the land and the spirits they believed governed their lives. When Pastor Tunda and Abike arrived, they were greeted warmly by the villagers. The elders spoke of their long history, their ancestors, and their connection to the gods who watched over them. The church was small, tucked at the edge of the village, almost as if it had been placed there to offer a quiet refuge in the midst of the ancient customs that defined the village. Though they were welcomed with open arms, there was an underlying tension in the air. The villagers were kind but cautious. They had seen outsiders come and go, each one bringing a different belief, a different vision. But few had stayed long enough to make a lasting impact. The people were devoted to their traditions, and no amount of persuasion would easily sway them from the practices that had been passed down through centuries. Abike was the first to notice it. There was something different in the way the women looked at her, something almost protective, as if they feared her presence would disturb the natural order of things. Pastor Tunda, ever the optimist, believed that with time, they would grow to understand that their faith in Christ did not threaten their culture but could coexist with it in harmony. As the days went by, Pastor Tunda began to learn more about the village's customs. The villagers spoke with reverence about the upcoming festival, a time of sacred celebration in honor of their gods. The festival was the most important event of the year, a time when the spirits of the ancestors were believed to walk among them. But it was also a time filled with danger, particularly for women. The village had an ancient rule: no woman was allowed to go outside after nightfall during the festival. It was said that the masquerades, the powerful and mysterious figures of the gods, would roam the streets, and any woman who was seen outside would be marked for death. The villagers spoke of the masquerades in hushed tones, their faces filled with awe and fear. The spirits were said to possess the ability to see into a person's soul, to know their deepest secrets, and to punish those who dared defy the sacred laws. Abike, however, was unfamiliar with these customs. She had lived in the city most of her life, where rules were made by man and not by gods. Her curiosity about the village's culture grew as she spent more time getting to know the people. She began visiting the new converts, those who had recently joined the church, offering them counsel and prayer. These visits became her routine, and she would visit them one by one, listening to their stories and offering comfort where it was needed. The day before the festival, she had been making her rounds, visiting each of the new believers in their homes. They welcomed her with open arms, grateful for her kindness and prayers. One by one, she walked from house to house, offering words of encouragement, and with each visit, she grew closer to the people. Her heart swelled with love for the village, its people, and their unique way of life. But the evening was falling quickly, and Abike had lost track of time. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the village. The rhythm of the drums from the festival had already started, their deep beats echoing through the trees. As Abiki left the last home, she realized just how late it had become. The path back to her home was quiet, but there was a sense of tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The village, normally peaceful and serene, now felt different. The air was thick with the weight of tradition, the drums growing louder with every step she took. Abike's heart began to race as she neared the edge of the village. She knew the rule: no woman was to be outside during the festival. But she had never imagined that the festival would carry such a heavy, tangible fear with it. As she reached the outskirts of the village, she could see the first signs of the masquerades. They were draped in elaborate costumes, their faces hidden behind masks carved from wood, their bodies wrapped in cloths adorned with beads and feathers. The sound of their footsteps was soft, but their presence was powerful. They were coming, and Abike, caught in the middle of the village's strange customs, didn't know what to do. The fear she had heard about in whispers became real. Her instincts told her to run. In a panic, Abike turned sharply and dashed toward the forest, the trees swallowing her up in their darkness. She didn't look back, but her mind raced with thoughts of what could happen if the masquerades caught her. She had heard the stories, the terrifying tales of women who had defied the customs and were never seen again. She couldn't bear the thought of becoming one of those tales. As she ran deeper into the forest, her breath quickened, and the sound of the drums seemed to chase her, growing louder and more ominous. She stumbled, but didn't stop, her mind focused on reaching the safety of her home. Her only thought was to make it back to Pastor Tunda, to warn him, to keep him safe. The evening had fallen over the village, and the air was thick with an uneasy stillness. The once vibrant colors of the day had faded, replaced by the deep purples and blacks of night. The soft rustle of leaves in the trees, the occasional croak of a frog from the nearby swamp, and the distant call of birds were the only sounds in the otherwise silent village. But tonight was different. There was a palpable tension in the air, an electricity that crackled through the night like the promise of an approaching storm. Abike had finished visiting the last of the new converts. She had spent hours walking through the village, offering counsel and prayer, offering hope to the people who had embraced her husband's message. Each home she visited was filled with gratitude, the warmth of fellowship, and the kind words of those whose hearts had been touched by the gospel. She was doing what she had always dreamed of, serving as a guiding light for those lost in darkness. But as the evening wore on, she became aware of how quickly the sun had set. The sky had turned from a soft pink to a deep, dusky purple, and the first of the festival drums began to echo through the village. The festival was upon them, the sacred time when the gods would be honored and the masquerades would take to the streets. The rhythm of the drums had always seemed far away during the day, but now, in the dark, they felt far too close, resonating in her chest, growing louder with each passing minute. Abike glanced at the sky, realizing with a shock that it was much later than she had thought. She had lost track of time in the company of the villagers, and now, the night had crept up on her, cloaking the world in a darkness that felt unnatural. The village, normally so full of life, now appeared strangely silent. The faces of the villagers who had once smiled warmly at her now appeared more distant, as if they had disappeared into the shadows. The fear she had heard about in hushed tones, fear of the masquerades, now crept into her heart. She had never truly understood the extent of the village's customs, not until now. Abike had heard stories from the women, tales about the masquerades that terrified them. She had seen the intensity of the elders, warnings about the night, but it was only now, standing on the edge of the village, that the weight of those words fully sank in. The festival was sacred to the villagers, a time when the masquerades, believed to be the spirits of the gods, would come to walk among them. The masquerades were said to possess the ability to see into the souls of the living, to know who was pure and who had broken the sacred laws. Women, it was said, had no place in the streets during the festival, for the masquerades would judge them. The village's ancient rule had been in place for as long as anyone could remember. No woman could venture outside after nightfall, for it was believed that the spirits would punish any woman who dared to defy this law. The punishment was severe. Those who were found after dark were taken by the masquerades and sacrificed to the gods. Abike had tried to push these fears to the back of her mind. She had been raised in a world where logic and reason prevailed, where customs were not so firmly tied to ancient fears and superstitions. But as the drums grew louder, something shifted in the air, something darker and more ominous. Abike felt the weight of the village's traditions pressing down on her, like an invisible hand closing around her chest. She stood there for a moment, torn between the path back to her husband and the growing sense of dread that was now clinging to her. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of the fear that had suddenly overtaken her. She knew the way back to their home was long and winding, a path that would take her through the outskirts of the village before plunging into the forest. Paths seemed like the only way to get back quickly, but she was aware of the risks. The shadows of the trees loomed ahead, dark and unfathomable. Abike had heard stories of women who had ventured into the night, only to vanish, never to return. The villagers spoke of the masquerades with reverence, as if they were gods in their own right, capable of seeing into the deepest corners of a person's heart. With a quick glance toward the village, Abike made a decision. She would take the path through the forest, hoping the trees would offer her some protection. Her heart beat rapidly in her chest as she started down the narrow dirt path, the once familiar road now feeling strange and foreboding. The air seemed to grow thicker with every step, the shadows deepening around her. As she moved deeper into the trees, the sounds of the festival grew louder. The drumming was now joined by a chorus of voices, chanting in an ancient, guttural rhythm. Abike quickened her pace, her footsteps light on the dirt, but the shadows seemed to follow her. The trees appeared to bend inward, their branches casting long, eerie shapes across her path. It was as if the very forest was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her thoughts were a whirlwind as she tried to stay calm. She could still hear the masquerades in the distance, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush, but she knew they were closing in on her. The fear that had been growing inside her now burst forth in a wave of panic. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, but she did not stop. Her mind was set on one thing only, getting home. But just as she thought she had outrun the danger, the unmistakable sound of the masquerades' bells reached her ears. They were near, too near. Abike's heart leapt into her throat as she realized that the masquerades had spotted her. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and her feet flew faster over the uneven ground. She had no choice now. She had to keep running, had to keep going, for if she stopped, she knew she would never see her husband again. She prayed, silently, desperately, but her feet kept moving, driven by the terror that had taken over her heart. Her pulse raced as she burst from the forest and into the open area near their home. She didn't stop to look around, didn't pause for a breath. She just ran, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind focused solely on getting back to the safety of their compound. She reached the gate, her hands trembling as she opened it. But as she stepped into the compound, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The feeling was wrong. Something was amiss. Abike had no idea that the masquerades had already entered her compound, waiting for her. The night, which had once felt like a comforting shield, now seemed like a dark and oppressive force closing in on her. The night had fallen heavy over the village, the festival in full swing, its drums and chants echoing through the air like the heartbeat of an ancient world that refused to die. The village, usually calm and quiet, was now alive with a frantic energy. The masquerades, the very spirits of the gods, had emerged from the shadows, their bells ringing as they moved through the streets, their feet gliding silently over the earth, each step laden with the power of generations. To the villagers, they were not mere performers, these were the very messengers of their ancestors, beings who could see into the soul of anyone who dared stand before them. Pastor Tunde's heart pounded in his chest as he lay in bed, wide awake, unable to sleep. The silence that had settled over their compound was deceptive. He had felt an unease earlier in the night, a strange heaviness that pressed against his chest, but had dismissed it, thinking it merely the weight of his thoughts about the village and his mission. Yet, now, as the hours passed, a deep and instinctual fear had gripped him. His thoughts wandered to Abike, to her warmth and kindness, to the way she had cared for each new convert in the village. He had hoped she would return soon, but he had heard nothing from her. The sound of distant drumming reached his ears, muffled but insistent, as if calling him to action. He looked at the time, late, far too late for anyone to be out, especially his wife. His unease grew stronger, and he sat up in bed, the dim light of the lantern casting long shadows across the walls. The village's customs were strict, and Abike knew them well. She wouldn't have been out at this hour. She couldn't have been. He stood and made his way to the door, stepping out into the quiet compound. The air was thick, carrying the sharp scent of incense and the distant sound of chanting. It was the festival, the time when the masquerades took to the streets. He knew the rule. No woman was to be outside after dark, but Abike wasn't just any woman. She had embraced the culture, respected the people's ways, and had learned from their traditions. She wouldn't break such an important rule. At least, he thought she wouldn't. His heart raced as he moved to the gate and stepped out into the darkened path that led toward the village. The quiet was unsettling. He could hear the faint whispers of voices in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves, and then, nothing. The village, which had been alive with the excitement of the festival, now seemed eerily still. He felt a coldness crawl up his spine. Something was wrong. He ran through the dark, the shadows stretching and shifting as the wind began to stir. The further he went, the more oppressive the silence became. He could no longer hear the drums or the chants of the masquerades. There was only a haunting quiet, as if the very world had stopped spinning. His thoughts raced, and a sinking feeling gripped him. Abike wasn't home. She was somewhere out there, in the night, with the masquerades. His heart pounded harder as he broke into a sprint, moving past the homes of the villagers, through the empty streets. He tried to call out to her, but his voice was swallowed by the dense night air. His mind raced. She was strong, capable, and so full of faith. But she was also vulnerable in a way she did not yet understand, caught between the world she had known and the ancient traditions of the people who had lived here long before her arrival. It wasn't long before he reached the outskirts of the village, and then, there, at the edge of the forest, he saw them. The masquerades. They moved through the dark like shadows themselves, gliding over the earth, their feet barely touching the ground. The rattling of their bells echoed through the air, and the eerie sound of their chants filled the night. Pastor Tunde's blood ran cold as he realized that the festival spirits were not just part of the celebration, they were part of the village's harsh customs, and they did not welcome outsiders. He didn't know how they had found her, how they had seen her, but it was clear now that Abike was in their grasp. They had taken her. The realization struck him like a thunderbolt. His body went cold as he followed the trail of the masquerades through the forest. Their eerie song echoed, like a warning, growing louder with each step. He ran faster, pushing himself forward, the need to save his wife burning in his chest. The village was behind him now, swallowed by the darkness, and ahead of him lay the king's palace. The king's palace, nestled at the heart of the village, was the center of the village's authority and power. Its high walls were adorned with ancient symbols of protection, and its gates were adorned with carvings that told stories of the gods and spirits. The palace had long been a place of mystery, a place where power and fear coexisted. The masquerades, the very beings who walked the streets during the festival, answered to the king, and his authority over them was absolute. As Pastor Tunde reached the gates of the palace, he saw her, Abike, tied and struggling in the hands of the masquerades. They held her as though she were no more than a prisoner. His heart leapt in his chest, and with all the strength he could muster, he ran toward them, his voice hoarse with panic. Abike, no, the masquerades, with their dark masks and robes, turned toward him with cold, lifeless eyes. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Their eyes, sharp and knowing, glinted with malicious intent. Before he could reach her, several of the masquerades descended upon him, grabbing him with terrifying strength. His body was flung to the ground, and before he could get back up, they began to beat him. Fists rained down on him, each strike heavy with the weight of the village's unspoken rules. His body ached, his vision blurred, but he could still hear Abike's cries, muffled by the spirit's grip. They dragged him away, his body limp and bloodied, and threw him into a small, dark cell within the king's palace. It was cold and damp, the stone walls echoing with the sounds of the night. Abike was thrown in beside him, her body bruised and trembling, but her spirit remained strong. Her eyes met his, and despite everything, there was a flicker of hope. "What will they do to us?" Abike whispered, her voice trembling. "Pastor, they will not have us," Pastor Tunda said, his voice rough, but steady. "We belong to God. No man or spirit has the power to take us from him." But deep inside, Pastor Tunda wasn't so sure. The masquerades, the customs, the traditions, they were powerful, too powerful. He didn't know how, but he knew that the only way they could survive was through faith. As the hours passed, the dread of the upcoming sacrifice hung in the air. The villagers, many of whom had been watching from afar, now stood silent in their homes, wondering what the masquerades would do next. Pastor Tunda and Abike were in the palace, locked away like prisoners, waiting for the day of the sacrifice to come. The masquerades spoke of it in hushed voices, 7 days. A sacrifice for the gods. The silence was deafening, but in the stillness of their cell, Pastor Tunda closed his eyes, clutching his wife's hand. The night was long, but they would not give up. They would wait for the dawn. For faith could not be bound by walls. The hours in the cell were long and suffocating. The air inside the dark, cold stone room was thick with despair, and the dampness seemed to seep into their bones. Pastor Tunda and Abike sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together, their spirits heavy but not yet broken. Abike's face was bruised, her eyes weary, but her faith remained unshaken. Her husband's presence, though battered and bloodied, was a comfort to her. The strength he had always shown, even in the face of overwhelming danger, had not faltered in this moment of darkness. The sounds of the masquerades outside were distant, but the occasional chant, the rattle of their bells, and the eerie drumming from the festival filled the air. The village had become alive with an otherworldly rhythm, and the atmosphere seemed charged with the energy of a looming sacrifice. The night stretched endlessly, and each passing hour seemed to deepen the fear that gripped the village, and Pastor Tunda and Abike knew the worst was yet to come. It was the 7th day, the day of the sacrifice. The masquerades, whose spirits were said to be bound by ancient oaths to the gods, were preparing for the final ceremony. The villagers, too, had begun to gather, filling the streets outside the palace in anticipation. The king, seated in the grand hall of the palace, awaited the ritual with solemnity. It was customary, this had been the village's way for centuries. A sacrifice was needed to ensure the favor of the gods for another year of good harvests, health, and prosperity. In the eyes of the villagers, this was the price that must be paid. Pastor Tunda's thoughts raced, his mind a flurry of prayers and pleas to the Almighty. He had been silent for the last few hours, deep in thought, as his wife sat beside him, her hand still clutched in his. There was a weight to the silence. Both of them knew that they were not just fighting for their own lives but for the very souls of the villagers who had been deceived into believing in the power of these spirits. The sun had set hours ago, and the palace grounds were now illuminated by the flickering lights of torches that dotted the courtyard. Shadows danced on the stone walls as the masquerades began to prepare for the ceremony. The chanting grew louder, and the steady rhythm of the drums reverberated through the air like a heartbeat. The air, thick with incense and anticipation, pressed against their chests, threatening to suffocate them. Abike felt a calmness begin to settle in her heart. She could feel the weight of her husband's prayers, even though he had not yet spoken. The stillness around them became louder than the sounds of the festival. It was in that moment that she knew that something beyond human power was at work. "Pastor," she whispered, her voice low but steady, "do you believe God will deliver us tonight?" Tunde's voice, hoarse from hours of praying, broke the silence. He had not given up. "Abike, I believe with all my heart that God has not brought us here to die. He has led us into this village for a purpose. We have walked with faith, and we will walk with faith into whatever He has in store for us." Abike's eyes filled with tears. "I am not afraid," she said softly, "for I know that God is with us." They sat in the dark, their hands locked together in a prayer that rose from the depths of their souls. Pastor Tunde began to speak the words he had clung to through every trial, every tribulation. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." As he spoke the words of Psalm 23, a warmth began to fill the room. The cold, oppressive air that had been hanging heavy around them seemed to lighten. Abike, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, joined him in prayer. Together, their voices lifted into the night. "God, we trust you. We believe that you are our refuge, our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. We place our lives in your hands." Outside, the chanting of the masquerades grew louder, and the drumbeats seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. But inside the cell, all was still except for the prayers of the pastor and his wife. The light around them began to change, and though the flames from the torches outside cast long shadows, a strange glow began to fill their small cell. It was then that Pastor Tunde felt it, the overwhelming power of God's presence, like a great wave crashing over him. His voice grew louder as he spoke in tongues, the prayer flowing from him like a river, unstoppable and pure. He called upon the name of the Lord, asking for deliverance, asking for His divine intervention. "Lord, let your will be done tonight. Deliver us from the powers of darkness. Let your light shine through this night, and let your name be glorified." Suddenly, there was a mighty rumble, like thunder crashing through the sky. The ground beneath them shook, the very walls of the palace trembling. The chanting from outside faltered, and the drumbeats grew erratic, as if the spirits were losing control. Abike's eyes widened, and she felt a presence unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if the heavens themselves had heard their prayers. Pastor Tunde's voice rose to a crescendo, his words becoming more forceful with each passing second. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I rebuke every power of darkness, every spirit that has held this village in bondage. I command you to leave, to go in the name of the Lord." And then, something extraordinary happened. The door to their cell burst open with a force that sent a gust of wind through the room. The masquerades, who had been preparing for the sacrifice, suddenly stopped in their tracks. The light around Pastor Tunde and Abike grew blinding, and the masquerades fell back, their masks shaking, their forms flickering like shadows. The very air seemed to grow heavy, vibrating with an unseen power. In that instant, the light in the room flared, and a voice, deep and resonant, filled the air, speaking words that seemed to shake the foundations of the palace itself. "Enough," the voice commanded, and the ground beneath them trembled in response. The masquerades, their power broken, fell to their knees in fear, their once imposing figures now reduced to mere shadows. The spirits that had inhabited them shrieked in terror as the divine light pierced through the darkness, banishing the ancient forces that had held the village in thrall. Pastor Tunde and Abike remained standing, their hands still joined in prayer, their hearts full of awe and wonder. The king, who had been watching from the palace, now stood frozen, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. The villagers who had gathered outside looked on in amazement as the spirits of the masquerades crumbled to dust. In that moment, the power of God's deliverance was made manifest. The sun had barely begun to rise over the village, its golden rays stretching across the horizon as if signaling the birth of a new day, a day that would change everything for the people who had long lived in fear. The air, still cool with the remnants of the night, felt different, as if the very earth had been reborn. What had been a long and oppressive night of terror was now giving way to the promise of hope. The night, thick with the fear of the masquerades and the looming sacrifice, had passed, and with it, the ancient hold on the village seemed to have loosened. Pastor Tunda and Abike stood outside the king's palace, their bodies bruised but their spirits stronger than ever. The night had left its marks, scrapes and cuts from the harsh beating they had endured, but the peace they now felt was far greater than the pain. Abike's heart swelled with gratitude, and as she stood next to her husband, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of awe. The miracle that had taken place was beyond anything they could have imagined. They had prayed for deliverance, and they had been delivered. The villagers, once too fearful to even speak of the masquerades, were now gathering in the open, staring at the palace in wonder. Word had spread quickly, the masquerades had been defeated, the spirits vanquished, and the long-held traditions that had once held the village captive had been broken. The king, once a figure of authority who had upheld the ancient customs, now stood before the people, his face pale with shock and disbelief. Pastor Tunda's voice, once weak from the ordeal, now rang out strong and clear, carried by the wind that swept through the village. The power that held you in fear has been broken. The masquerades are no more. The gods you have served are not gods at all. There is only one God, the God of heaven and earth, and he has delivered us. The villagers listened in silence, many of them unsure of what to believe, yet some with hope dawning in their eyes. They had lived their entire lives under the weight of the masquerades' power, never daring to question the customs, never once thinking that anything could change. But now, standing before them, was evidence that their world could be different, that they could live without fear, without the oppressive weight of the spirits that had once ruled their lives. The king, his hands trembling, finally spoke. What has happened here? His voice was weak, as if the strength had been drained from him by the very force of the change that had taken place. Your gods are no gods, Pastor Tunda repeated, his eyes locking with the king's. They have been exposed for what they are. And now, you have a choice. You can continue down this path of fear and sacrifice, or you can turn to the true God, the God who has the power to save, the God who has shown mercy to us all. The king took a step back, his mind reeling. He had been raised to believe that the masquerades were sacred, that they were the earthly manifestations of divine power. To hear Pastor Tunda speak of them so definitively, to see the transformation before him, was more than his mind could process. Abike, seeing the king's confusion, stepped forward gently. We have not come to condemn you, my king. We have come to offer you something greater. A new way, one of peace, freedom, and hope. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces in the crowd were filled with skepticism, others with longing, but all of them were listening. Pastor Tunda's words had planted a seed in their hearts. The seeds of doubt about the masquerades and the old ways had already begun to take root. In the distance, the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, bathing the village in a soft golden light. For the first time in what felt like forever, the village seemed to be awakening to something new. The drums, which had once resonated with fear, were now silent. The air was still, save for the whispers of the villagers, who were now turning toward each other, sharing stories, asking questions. Abike glanced at Pastor Tunda and then back to the crowd, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She could see the change, even if it was small, flickering in their eyes. They were beginning to understand. The miracle had not only saved them from physical harm, it had opened their eyes to the truth. As the day grew brighter, the crowd began to disperse, but many lingered. Some were eager to hear more, others unsure of what to make of the sudden shift in their lives. But there was no denying that something profound had happened. That evening, as the sun began to set on the village once more, the two of them, Pastor Tunde and Abike stood together, watching as the village began to change before their very eyes. The villagers gathered around the church, many of them for the first time. Abike and Tunde had prepared a small service of thanks, a simple prayer to honor the God who had delivered them. As Pastor Tunde stood before the congregation, his voice was full of gratitude, his heart swelling with a sense of peace that only came from knowing God had moved in a mighty way. Tonight, we will pray together. Tonight, we will thank the God who has delivered us from darkness. No longer will we be slaves to fear. No longer will we be bound by the chains of tradition and superstition. The people, hesitant at first, began to kneel, to bow their heads, their hearts heavy with the weight of all that had been revealed to them. They were broken, but they were no longer afraid. Pastor Tunde raised his hands toward the heavens, and Abike stood beside him, her hands lifted in prayer. Together, they prayed for the village. They prayed for healing, for restoration, and for the strength to move forward in a new way. And as the prayer came to an end, something miraculous happened. A quiet peace settled over the village. The sound of the festival drums was gone. The air felt lighter. The village, once caught in the grips of ancient fear, was now bathed in the warmth of a new hope. The villagers stood, eyes full of wonder, some of them wiping away tears, some simply standing in silence, taking in the magnitude of what had just transpired. It was as if a great burden had been lifted from their shoulders, and in its place was a sense of renewal, a glimmer of a future untainted by fear and superstition. As Pastor Tunde and Abike walked home that night, hand in hand, the weight of the day seemed to lift from their hearts. They had been through the fire. They had faced darkness and come out the other side. And now, they could see the change in the village, not just in the hearts of the villagers, but in the very air around them. Pastor Tunde turned to Abike and smiled. "This is just the beginning." Abike nodded, her heart light. "Yes, it is. A new dawn has come." And as they walked into the night, the stars above seemed brighter than ever. The village, once trapped in the shadows of its own traditions, had found its way into the light. A new dawn has arrived. The village, once trapped in fear, was now free. Through faith, prayer, and courage, Pastor Tunde and Abike had led the people into a new beginning, a life filled with hope and freedom. The power of faith transformed not only their lives but the entire village. Don't miss out on more inspiring stories. Subscribe to our channel and be part of this incredible journey of transformation.